The Arizona sun hung merciless in the cloudless sky, baking the cracked earth of the McKenna ranch until it resembled broken pottery. Thomas McKenna stood on his porch, his weathered hands gripping the wooden rail as he surveyed what remained of his life's work. 5 years of drought had reduced his once thriving cattle operation to a handful of skeletal steers and a prayer that never seemed to reach heaven. The wind carried dust devils across the barren fields, where corn should have grown tall and green. Instead, brittle stalks jutted from the ground, like the bones of some ancient creature, a testament to nature's cruel indifference. Thomas removed his worn hat and ran calloused fingers through graying hair that had once been the color of Highland heather. At 43, he felt decades older. "Pa?" The voice belonged to his 16-year-old daughter, Sarah, who emerged from the adobe house they'd built with such hope 7 years ago. Her once bright blue dress now hung loose on her frame, faded by countless washings and the relentless sun. "Ma's asking about supper." Thomas turned to face his daughter, seeing too much of his late wife in her determined chin and steady gaze. Mary had died of fever 2 winters past, leaving him to raise Sarah and 12-year-old Jamie alone. The responsibility weighed heavier than the drought itself. "Tell your mother," he caught himself, the familiar ache of grief tightening his chest. "Tell yourself and Jamie we'll make do with what we have." What they had was precious little. The root cellar held 3 potatoes, a handful of dried beans, and 1 loaf of bread Sarah had baked that morning with the last of their flour. The nearest town, Copper Creek, lay 20 miles south, but Thomas had no money for supplies and too much pride to beg. As Sarah disappeared back into the house, Thomas noticed movement near the property line, where scrub brush marked the boundary between his land and the vast Apache reservation. A figure approached slowly, and Thomas instinctively reached for the rifle propped against the porch post. Relations between white settlers and the Apache had been tense since Geronimo's final surrender the previous year, though most of the violence had ceased. The figure resolved into a woman, her long black hair braided with strips of leather, wearing a simple brown dress that marked her as Apache. She carried something in her arms, a bundle wrapped in faded cloth. As she drew closer, Thomas could see exhaustion in every line of her body, the careful way she placed each step, as if the earth might give way beneath her feet. She stopped at the edge of his property, perhaps 30 yards away, and called out in accented English, "Please, senor, my child is sick." Thomas descended the porch steps slowly, the rifle still in his hand, but pointed at the ground. The woman appeared to be in her 20s, with intelligent, dark eyes that held both desperation and dignity. The bundle in her arms stirred, and Thomas glimpsed a small face, flushed with fever. "What do you want?" he asked, not unkindly, but with the wariness of a man who'd learned that survival often depended on careful choices. "Food," she said simply. "Water. My son has not eaten in 2 days." Thomas felt his stomach clench, remembering his own children's hollow cheeks at the breakfast table that morning. The Apache reservation had been struck by the same drought that plagued his ranch, but the government supplies were notoriously unreliable. He'd heard rumors of starvation among the tribes, though few white settlers spoke of it openly. "I'm Thomas McKenna," he said, stepping closer. "What's your name?" "Ayana," she replied. "It means eternal blossom in my language, though there are few blossoms in this season of dying." The poetry in her words surprised him, as did the sadness that seemed to encompass more than just her current circumstances. Thomas looked at the child in her arms, a boy of perhaps 4 years, his breathing rapid and shallow. "How long has he been sick?" 3 days. The fever came with the new moon." Ayana's voice cracked slightly. "I have tried everything my grandmother taught me, but the drought has killed even the healing plants." Thomas glanced back at his house, thinking of his own children inside, of the single loaf of bread that represented their supper. He thought of the unwritten rules of the frontier. Charity began at home, and trust was a luxury few could afford. He thought of Mary, who would have already invited this woman inside without a second thought. "Wait here," he said, leaning the rifle against a fence post. He walked back to the house, his boots heavy on the sun-baked ground. Inside, Sarah was setting their meager table, while Jamie played with carved wooden soldiers by the window. The loaf of bread sat on the counter, golden brown and still warm from the oven, filling the small kitchen with its comforting aroma. "Sarah," Thomas said quietly, "wrap that bread in a cloth." His daughter looked up, confusion creasing her brow. "Pa, that's all we have for—" "I know what it is." Thomas's voice was firm but gentle. "There's a woman outside with a sick child. They haven't eaten in days. Sarah's eyes widened, and for a moment, Thomas saw the struggle play across her young face, hunger warring with compassion, fear battling with her mother's teachings about Christian charity. Then she nodded and began wrapping the bread in a clean kitchen towel. "What about us?" Jamie asked from the window, having overheard the conversation. Thomas knelt beside his son, placing a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "We'll manage, son. We always do." But as he carried the wrapped bread outside to where Ayana waited, Thomas wondered if this act of mercy might be the final nail in his family's coffin. The woman's face transformed when she saw the bundle in his hands, hope replacing despair like sunrise breaking over the desert. "Thank you," she whispered, accepting the bread with trembling hands. "May the spirits bless you for your kindness." Thomas watched as she carefully tore off a small piece and placed it between her son's cracked lips. The boy's eyes fluttered open, and he began to chew weakly. Something in Thomas's chest loosened at the sight. "There's a well behind the house," he said. "The water's still clean." As Ayana followed him to the well, Thomas caught sight of Sarah watching from the window, her hand pressed against the glass. He wondered what kind of world he was leaving his children, one where kindness was folded into impossibility, or one where it remained the last bright thing when everything else had turned to dust. "Daar silmaisas, during 3 hours past sunset." Thomas sat alone on his porch, smoking his last precious cigarette and watching stars emerge in the vast desert sky. Ayana and her son had departed an hour earlier, the boy walking on his own strength after consuming half the bread and drinking deeply from the well. She had offered no payment. What could she give that he needed? But had pressed his hand between both of hers, speaking words in Apache that he didn't understand, but felt in his bones. The house behind him was quiet. Sarah and Jamie had accepted their supper of boiled potatoes without complaint, though he'd seen his daughter's eyes linger on the empty spot where the bread should have been. They were good children, raised to understand that sometimes sacrifice was the price of keeping one's soul intact. The sound of approaching hooves broke the desert silence. Thomas tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward his rifle, but relaxed when he recognized the voice calling his name. Jack Morrison rode into the circle of lamplight, his horse breathing hard from what must have been a fast ride from town. "Tom!" Morrison swung down from his saddle, his face grim in the flickering light. "We need to talk." Jack Morrison was Thomas's closest neighbor, though close meant 15 miles in this country. A former cavalry sergeant, he'd settled in Copper Creek after his service ended, and now owned the largest general store for 50 miles in any direction. He was also one of the few men Thomas trusted completely. "What brings you out here so late, Jack?" Morrison tied his horse to the porch rail and climbed the steps, his spurs jingling softly. "Word spreading through town about what happened today. Mrs. Henderson saw an Apache woman leaving your property this afternoon." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. Eleanor Henderson was the most notorious gossip in Copper Creek, a woman who could turn a simple act of charity into a scandal with the right twist of phrase. "What exactly is she saying? That you're consorting with hostiles, that you gave aid and comfort to the enemy?" Morrison pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Tom, you know I don't give a damn about Henderson's opinions, but there are others in town who do. People are scared, and scared people do stupid things." Thomas drew deeply on his cigarette, the ember glowing red in the darkness. "A hungry woman asked for food. I gave her bread. Since when is feeding a child a crime in Christian country? Since that child belongs to people who spent the better part of 20 years trying to kill us." Morrison's voice held no condemnation, only weary pragmatism. "I'm not saying it's right, Tom, but that's how folks see it. There's talk of organizing a committee to address the situation." The phrase hung between them like smoke. Thomas had heard of such committees before, groups of self-appointed guardians who took it upon themselves to enforce their version of frontier justice. The results were rarely pretty and never legal. "Let them talk," Thomas said, though his mind was already calculating distances to the nearest sheriff, weighing the likelihood of protection versus persecution. "I won't apologize for doing what Mary would have done." Morrison leaned against the porch rail, his expression troubled. "Your wife was a saint, Tom, but saints don't have to worry about lynch mobs. You've got children to think about." As if summoned by the mention of children, Sarah appeared in the doorway, wrapped in one of her mother's old shawls. "Pa, is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, sweetheart," Thomas said, forcing calm into his voice. "Mr. Morrison just stopped by to check on us." But Sarah's intelligent eyes moved between the two men, reading the tension in their postures, the weight of unspoken words. She'd grown up fast since her mother's death, forced to take on responsibilities no 16-year-old should bear. "It's about the Apache woman, isn't it?" she said quietly. Morrison looked surprised, but Thomas merely nodded. His daughter deserved honesty, even when truth was harder to swallow than hunger. "Some people in town think I made a mistake helping her," Thomas explained. "They're concerned about the implications." Sarah pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. What would Ma have done? The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. Mary McKenna had possessed an unwavering moral compass that never bent to convenience or fear. She would have given that woman the bread without hesitation, and probably invited her to stay for supper besides. "Your mother would have done exactly what I did," Thomas said firmly, "and she would have slept soundly afterward." "Then you did right," Sarah said, with a conviction that reminded Thomas powerfully of his late wife. "Whatever comes of it." Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Sarah, it's not that simple. There are practical considerations." "Mr. Morrison," Sarah interrupted with quiet dignity, "when did feeding hungry children become impractical?" The former sergeant had no answer for that. He stood in awkward silence for a moment, then cleared his throat. "Tom, I came out here to warn you not to argue philosophy with your daughter. Tomorrow's Sunday, and Father Miguel is planning to address the situation from the pulpit. Might be wise for you and the children to stay home this week." Thomas felt anger flare in his chest. Father Miguel had married him and Mary, had baptized both his children, had spoken beautiful words over Mary's grave. The idea that the priest might condemn an act of basic human decency from behind the altar was almost too much to bear. What's he planning to say? "I don't know for certain, but Henderson's been bending his ear all week. Something about the dangers of misplaced charity, the need to maintain proper boundaries between the races." Morrison's disgust was evident in his voice. "Politics dressed up as theology." Sarah made a sound of disgust. "Ma always said that any god worth worshipping would rather see children fed than boundaries maintained." "Your mother was a wise woman," Morrison agreed, "but wisdom and survival don't always walk the same path." Thomas stood and flicked his cigarette butt into the darkness, watching the ember arc through the night like a falling star. "Jack, I appreciate the warning. I truly do. But I can't live my life in fear of what small-minded people might think. I'm not asking you to live in fear. I'm asking you to be smart." Morrison moved toward his horse, pausing with his hand on the saddle horn. "This drought's got everyone on edge. People are looking for someone to blame, and a man who helps Apaches makes an easy target." As Morrison rode away, his words echoing in the desert night, Thomas remained on the porch with his daughter. The stars seemed brighter now, as if the darkness had deepened to accommodate their light. "Pa?" Sarah's voice was small, uncertain for the first time that evening. "Yes, sweetheart. Are we going to be all right?" Thomas pulled his daughter close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the trust in the way she leaned against him. "We're going to be fine," he said, hoping it was true. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." But as they stood in the vast silence of the desert night, both father and daughter wondered what morning would bring, and whether kindness would prove stronger than fear in the harsh arithmetic of frontier survival. Sunday morning dawned clear and merciless, the sun already promising another day of punishing heat before it cleared the eastern mountains. Thomas stood before the cracked mirror in his bedroom, carefully shaving with the last sliver of soap, preparing for what he suspected would be the most important church service of his life. Sarah had laid out his best shirt, the white cotton one Mary had sewn for their wedding anniversary 3 years ago, and his black Sunday pants. The clothes felt foreign on his body, too formal for a man who spent his days wrestling with drought and dying cattle, but appearances mattered in small towns, and today more than most. "Pa, you sure about this?" Jamie asked from the doorway, his 12-year-old face creased with worry that belonged on someone much older. Thomas wiped the razor clean and turned to his son. "We've never missed Sunday service, boy. I don't intend to start now." But the truth was more complicated. Part of him wanted to stay home, to avoid the stares and whispered conversations that would surely follow Eleanor Henderson's poisoned tongue. Another part, the part that sounded suspiciously like Mary's voice, insisted that hiding would only confirm the gossip's worst assumptions about his character. The ride to Copper Creek took an hour across terrain that grew more desolate with each passing week. The McKenna family traveled in silence, their wagon wheels finding every rut and stone in the hardpan road. Sarah sat ramrod straight beside Thomas on the driver's bench, her chin set in a way that reminded him powerfully of her mother facing down adversity. Jamie sprawled in the wagon bed, ostensibly watching the landscape but really stealing glances at his father's tense profile. Copper Creek wasn't much of a town. 24 buildings clustered around a single main street, with the church occupying the highest ground like a beacon of civilization in the wilderness. But it represented community, commerce, and connection to the wider world for scattered ranchers and prospectors within a 50-mile radius. As their wagon approached the church, Thomas noticed the unusual number of horses and carriages already gathered. Sunday service typically drew 30 or 40 souls. Today it looked like half the county had turned out. His jaw tightened as he recognized the implications. "Lot of folks here today," Sarah observed quietly. "Word travels fast in small towns," Thomas replied, pulling their wagon into line with the others. The McKenna family's arrival didn't go unnoticed. Conversations died as they climbed down from their wagon, replaced by the kind of charged silence that precedes either violence or revelation. Thomas helped Sarah down, while Jamie scrambled over the tailgate, and together they walked toward the church entrance. Eleanor Henderson stood near the front steps like a self-appointed sentinel, her black dress and severe expression marking her as the town's unofficial moral authority. Her pale eyes fixed on Thomas with unmistakable hostility. "Thomas McKenna," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "how generous of you to join us this morning." The words dripped with false courtesy, but Thomas merely tipped his hat. "Mrs. Henderson, beautiful morning for worship." "Indeed it is, though I wonder if all present truly understand the meaning of Christian charity." Before Thomas could respond, Jack Morrison appeared at his elbow, his presence both welcome and protective. "Morning, Tom. Sarah, you look lovely as always. Jamie, I hear you've been helping your father with the cattle." Morrison's easy conversation provided cover as they moved into the church, but Thomas could feel dozens of eyes tracking their progress down the center aisle. He chose their usual pew, third from the front on the right side, where Mary had always insisted they sit because she believed children learned better when they could see clearly. Father Miguel emerged from the vestry as the last stragglers found their seats. The priest was a small, thin man in his 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen too much of frontier hardship. He'd ministered to this congregation for 8 years, baptizing their children, marrying their young, and burying their dead with equal compassion. But today something was different in his demeanor. His usual warmth seemed strained, and his gaze avoided Thomas's section of the church entirely. The service began normally enough, hymns sung in voices cracked by dust and worry, prayers offered for rain and redemption, the familiar rhythm of ritual that bound this community together, despite their differences. But Thomas sensed the congregation's restlessness, their eagerness for whatever drama had drawn them here in such numbers. Father Miguel's sermon text came from the Gospel of Matthew. "For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me." Thomas felt Sarah stiffen beside him. The choice of scripture could hardly be coincidental. "My dear brothers and sisters," Father Miguel began, his voice carrying easily through the packed church. "We live in times that test our faith in ways both large and small. The drought that afflicts our land also parches our souls, making us forget sometimes the fundamental truths of Christian charity." The priest paused, his eyes finally finding Thomas in the congregation. For a moment, the two men looked at each other across the space that separated pulpit from pew, and Thomas saw something like apology in the older man's expression. "Yet we must ask ourselves," Father Miguel continued, "what form should this charity take? How do we balance compassion with wisdom, mercy with prudence?" Eleanor Henderson leaned forward in her front row seat, her face bright with anticipation. "There are those who would say that charity knows no boundaries, that hunger is hunger regardless of race or creed. And indeed, our Lord fed the multitudes without first inquiring about their political affiliations or tribal membership." A murmur ran through the congregation, approval from some quarters, unease from others. But we must also remember that charity without wisdom can become mere sentiment, and sentiment without judgment can lead to consequences we never intended. Father Miguel's voice grew stronger, more certain. "The Good Samaritan helped a stranger on the road, yes, but he also used discernment. He bound up wounds but did not invite the robbers to his table." Thomas felt heat rising in his cheeks. The comparison was subtle but unmistakable. He was being cast as a fool who couldn't distinguish between legitimate need and potential threat. Furthermore, the priest continued, warming to his theme, we must consider our responsibilities to our own families, our own community. Can a man be called charitable who endangers his children in the name of helping strangers? Can we call it Christian love when our generosity potentially exposes our neighbors to harm? Sarah's hand found Thomas's and squeezed it tightly. Across the aisle, he saw Jack Morrison's face darken with anger, but the storekeeper remained silent. I do not speak of these things to condemn any individual, Father Miguel said, though his meaning was clear to everyone present. Rather, I call upon all of us to examine our consciences, to ensure that our actions spring from true wisdom rather than mere impulse, from genuine love rather than misguided sentiment. The sermon continued for another 10 minutes, but Thomas heard little of it. His mind was reeling from the public rebuke, the careful assassination of his character, dressed up in theological language. When the final hymn was sung and the benediction pronounced, he remained seated while the congregation filed past, some offering sympathetic nods, others studiously avoiding his gaze. Eleanor Henderson paused at their pew, her thin lips curved in something that might have been a smile. Wonderful sermon, don't you think, Mr. McKenna? So relevant to our current circumstances. Thomas stood slowly, his full height giving him an advantage over the smaller woman. I found it interesting, Mrs. Henderson, though I can't help wondering what our Lord would think of using his word to justify turning away hungry children. The woman's face flushed red. That child was Apache, Mr. McKenna, the same people who murdered the Hendricks family just 2 years ago. That child was 4 years old and dying of fever, Thomas replied quietly. Last I heard, 4-year-olds weren't much threat to anyone. Children grow up, Henderson snapped. And they remember who showed them kindness when they were small. Yes, Sarah said, speaking for the first time, her young voice carrying clearly through the emptying church. They do remember kindness. I wonder what they remember about cruelty. The exchange might have escalated, but Father Miguel approached, his face troubled. Thomas, might I speak with you privately? Thomas nodded, gesturing for Sarah and Jamie to wait outside. When the church had emptied except for the 2 men, the priest sat heavily in the front pew, suddenly looking every one of his 54 years. I'm sorry, Thomas. I didn't want to preach that sermon. But you did preach it. Thomas's voice held no anger, only disappointment. Why? Because Bishop Martinez received a letter from concerned parishioners. Because there's talk of asking for my transfer if I can't maintain proper moral guidance in this community. Father Miguel looked up at Thomas with tired eyes. Because I'm a coward who values his position more than his principles. The honesty of the admission took Thomas aback. He'd expected defensiveness, theological justification, anything but this raw confession of human weakness. What would you have done, Miguel, if it had been your door she knocked on? The priest was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the simple wooden cross that dominated the front of the church. I would have given her the bread, he said finally, and I would have slept better than I have these past 3 nights. Thomas felt some of his anger drain away, replaced by something like pity for this good man caught between conscience and survival. Then we understand each other. As Thomas walked toward the church door, Father Miguel called after him. Thomas, be careful. Henderson and her allies, they're not finished with this. There's talk of a town meeting tomorrow night. Thomas paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright morning sun. Let them talk, Miguel. I've got nothing to hide. But as he rejoined his children for the long ride home, Thomas wondered if truth and righteousness would be enough to protect his family from the storm that was clearly gathering on the horizon. Monday's dawn brought no relief from the heat, but it did bring an unexpected visitor. Thomas was repairing a section of fence that had finally surrendered to the wind when he spotted a lone rider approaching from the east, not from town, but from the direction of the Apache reservation. He set down his tools and walked toward the house, calling for Sarah to bring him his rifle. The rider was still too distant to identify, but something about the easy way they sat their horse suggested either supreme confidence or complete lack of hostile intent. As the figure drew closer, Thomas realized it was Ayana, though she looked different in daylight, riding astride a paint horse with the natural grace of someone born to the saddle. She wore the same simple brown dress as before, but her long hair was loose now, flowing behind her like a black banner. Pa? Sarah emerged from the house, rifle in hand, but pointed at the ground. I see her. Thomas accepted the weapon but didn't raise it. Something in Ayana's approach spoke of purpose rather than threat. Stay close to the house, but don't run inside. If she meant harm, she wouldn't come alone in broad daylight. Ayana reined in her horse 20 yards from the porch, the same respectful distance she'd maintained 2 days earlier. Her son was with her this time, sitting behind her on the horse, his color much improved, and his dark eyes bright with curiosity rather than fever. "Mr. McKenna," she called, her accented English carrying clearly in the still air. "I come to speak with you." Thomas walked forward, the rifle loose in his hands. "How's the boy?" "Strong again, thanks to your kindness." Ayana dismounted fluidly, then helped her son down from the horse. "I'm not here to ask for more charity." "Then why are you here?" Instead of answering immediately, she reached into a leather bag tied to her saddle and withdrew something wrapped in soft deerskin. "My name is Ayana Delgado. My father was Mexican, my mother Apache. I speak 4 languages and can read in 3 of them. I know the land, the plants that heal, the signs that predict weather." She unwrapped the bundle, revealing dried herbs, roots, and what appeared to be seeds. "The drought that hurts your cattle, it hurts our people too. But my grandmother taught me things about surviving dry seasons that the whites have forgotten." Thomas studied her carefully. There was intelligence in her dark eyes, and a dignity that suggested she'd thought carefully about this visit. "What are you proposing?" "Work," she said simply. "I help your ranch survive the drought. You pay me in food, shelter for my son and me, nothing more." The offer was so unexpected that Thomas needed a moment to process it. "Why would you want to work for me?" "Because your children are hungry, and mine is too. Because this drought will not break soon. The signs all point to another year, maybe 2, because alone we might all die. Together we might live." Sarah had moved closer during the conversation, drawn by curiosity despite her father's instructions. "What kind of help?" she asked. Ayana turned to her with a slight smile. "You are the daughter. You have wisdom in your eyes, like your father." She gestured toward the struggling garden plot near the house. "Your plants die because you water them like plants in a wet climate. Desert plants need different care, and your cattle, they are eating grass that has no strength. I know where the good grass still grows, hidden in places the drought has not yet reached." Thomas felt a flicker of hope, quickly suppressed by practicality. "Even if what you say is true, you know what people in town would think. A white man employing an Apache woman." "People in town think many things that are not true," Ayana replied. "But people in town are not trying to save dying cattle and hungry children." Jamie had joined them now, his 12-year-old curiosity overcoming caution. "Can you really make plants grow in the drought?" Ayana knelt to his level, her manner gentle. "Not make them grow, little one, but help them find the water that is still there, hidden beneath the ground. Teach them to use less water, but stay strong." She stood and addressed Thomas again. "I do not ask you to decide now, but let me show you one thing." Without waiting for permission, she walked to Sarah's struggling vegetable garden, her son trailing behind. The tomato plants were brown and withered, the corn stalks barely knee-high. Ayana knelt and began examining the soil, her fingers probing the earth with practiced skill. "Here," she said, pointing to a spot near the tomatoes. "Water pools here when it rains, but you plant where it looks flat. The roots cannot find the moisture." She moved to another section. "And here, you plant too close together. In wet times, plants like to be close. In dry times, they must have space to search for water without competing." Thomas found himself following her assessment, seeing his garden with new eyes. What she said made sense. He'd been farming with Scottish techniques learned from his father, methods that assumed reliable rainfall and rich soil. "There is more," Ayana continued. "Plants that grow wild here, that the cattle can eat when grass fails. Ways to catch rainwater and hold it for the dry times. My people have lived in this desert for generations beyond counting. We know its secrets." Sarah looked at her father, hope and apprehension warring in her expression. "Pa, what if she's right?" Before Thomas could answer, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the conversation. 3 riders were coming fast from the direction of town, dust clouds marking their urgent pace. Thomas recognized Jack Morrison in the lead, followed by 2 other men from Copper Creek. "Trouble," he muttered, then called to Ayana. "You might want to mount up and ride out." But she shook her head, moving instead to stand beside her son, her chin raised with quiet defiance. "I am not afraid of angry white men. I have faced worse." Morrison and his companions reined in their horses in a cloud of dust and jingling spurs. The storekeeper's face was grim, while his companions, Bill Parker, who owned the livery stable, and Doc Henley, the town's physician, looked equally troubled. "Tom," Morrison said without preamble, "we need to talk. There's going to be a meeting tonight, and it's not going to be friendly." "I know about the meeting, Jack. Do you know Eleanor Henderson's been writing letters to the territorial governor? Do you know there's talk of petitioning to have your homestead claim revoked?" Morrison's eyes flicked to Ayanna, then back to Thomas. "And do you know that having an Apache woman on your property right now is about the worst thing you could do for your case?" Doc Henley, a soft-spoken man in his 60s, cleared his throat. "Thomas, I've known you since you first came to this territory. You're a good man, but you're making this harder on yourself than it needs to be." "How's that, Doc?" "By persisting in this association. People are scared, and scared people don't think clearly. They see an Apache woman on your ranch, and they assume the worst." Ayanna stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "What do they assume, Doctor? That I am here to steal, to murder children in their beds? Or perhaps they assume that I am less than human, unworthy of the basic kindness that one person owes another." The directness of her challenge left the three men uncomfortable. Bill Parker, a man who rarely spoke in groups, found his voice. "Ma'am, it's nothing personal, but your people and our people. There's been a lot of blood spilled. People have long memories." "Yes," Ayanna agreed. "I remember my uncle, killed by soldiers for the crime of hunting deer to feed his family. I remember my cousin, shot down while trying to surrender with a white flag. I remember children who died of hunger while government supplies sat rotting in warehouses. We all have memories." The quiet dignity of her words created an uncomfortable silence. Finally, Doc Henley spoke again. "What is it you want here, ma'am?" "Work," she said simply. "A chance to keep my son alive through this drought and to help others do the same." Morrison looked at Thomas with something like desperation. "Tom, even if she's sincere, you can't do this. Not now. The town meeting tonight, Henderson's got people worked up. There's talk of direct action." Thomas felt the familiar weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. Accept Ayanna's help and face the wrath of his neighbors, or send her away and watch his family slowly starve. Either path led through darkness, but only one offered hope of survival. "What kind of direct action?" he asked quietly. The three men exchanged glances, and Thomas saw the answer in their reluctance to speak. His blood ran cold as he realized what his neighbors were contemplating. "Pa," Sarah said softly, "what are they talking about?" Thomas looked at his daughter, then at Jamie, then at Ayanna and her son. 4 children whose futures hung in the balance, caught between the drought that threatened their bodies and the hatred that threatened their souls. "They're talking about fear," he said finally, "and what people do when they let fear make their decisions for them." The town meeting was scheduled for 8 o'clock, but by 7:30 the schoolhouse was already packed beyond capacity. Thomas arrived alone, having left his children at home with strict instructions to stay inside and keep the rifle loaded. Ayanna and her son had departed at his insistence, though not before sharing crucial information about hidden water sources and drought-resistant plants that might save his cattle. Every seat was filled, and men lined the walls like soldiers preparing for battle. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and thicker with tension. Eleanor Henderson sat in the front row, flanked by her supporters, her pale eyes gleaming with anticipation. Mayor Caldwell, a nervous man who owned the bank, stood behind the schoolmaster's desk, clearly uncomfortable with the crowd's mood. "Gentlemen," Caldwell began, his voice barely audible over the murmur of conversation. "Ladies, we're here tonight to discuss concerns that have been raised about recent events in our community." "Get on with it, Caldwell," called out Pete Morrison, Jack's hot-headed younger brother. "We all know why we're here." Thomas remained standing near the back, noting the faces around him. Some showed uncertainty, others determination, but too many reflected the kind of cold anger that led to midnight visits and burning buildings. He counted perhaps a dozen men who might stand with him if it came to violence, but twice that number who clearly would not. Eleanor Henderson rose from her seat with theatrical precision. "Mr. Mayor, if I may address the gathering." Caldwell nodded reluctantly, and Henderson turned to face the crowd, her black dress and severe expression casting her as a crow among peacocks. "Friends and neighbors," she began, her voice carrying easily through the packed room. "We gather tonight because our community faces a threat unlike any we have known. Not the honest threat of drought or disease, but the insidious danger of misguided charity that places Apache savages above Christian families. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Thomas felt his jaw tighten. Thomas McKenna, Henderson continued, her gaze finding him in the back of the room, stands accused of providing aid and comfort to our enemies, of placing his own family, and by extension all our families, at risk for the sake of Apache feelings. That's a lie, Thomas said, his voice cutting through the murmur. I fed a hungry child, nothing more, nothing less. A hungry Apache child, Henderson shot back. The same Apache who killed the Hendricks family, the same Apache who raided the Miller Ranch last spring. That child was 4 years old and dying of fever, Thomas replied, stepping forward. Unless you believe 4-year-olds are leading war parties now. Nervous laughter from some quarters, angry muttering from others. Mayor Caldwell banged his gavel for order. Furthermore, Thomas continued, I've since learned that the woman who came to my door isn't even full Apache. Her father was Mexican, and she speaks 4 languages. She's offered to help our community survive this drought using knowledge that could save cattle and crops. Apache knowledge, Henderson spat. Savage wisdom. What can those people teach civilized Christians about anything? Before Thomas could respond, an unexpected voice spoke from the middle of the room. They can teach us how to live in the desert. All eyes turned to see Dr. Henley standing, his weathered face thoughtful. I've been practicing medicine in this territory for 20 years, and I've seen what happens when people ignore native knowledge. Apache remedies have saved more lives than I care to count. You're talking about medicine, Doc, called out Bill Parker, not about letting hostiles onto our land. Am I? Dr. Henley's voice grew stronger. Because it seems to me that the Apache have been surviving droughts in this desert for centuries, while we've been here less than a decade and we're already struggling. Father Miguel, who had been sitting silently in the second row, slowly stood. Perhaps we should remember the parable of the Good Samaritan. Our Lord's example was to help those in need, regardless of their race or religion. The Good Samaritan wasn't dealing with Apache raiders, Henderson snapped. No, the priest replied quietly. He was dealing with Samaritans, who were considered enemies of the Jews. The whole point of the parable was that mercy transcends tribal boundaries. The room erupted in heated discussion, voices rising as neighbors argued with neighbors. Thomas watched the chaos with growing apprehension, knowing that mob emotions could turn violent with little provocation. Mayor Caldwell banged his gavel repeatedly. Order! We'll have order, or I'll clear this building. Gradually, the noise subsided, but the tension remained thick as smoke. Henderson had remained standing during the outburst, and now she played her final card. Very well, she said, her voice cutting through the settling murmur. Let's speak plainly. Thomas McKenna has chosen to side with Apache over his own neighbors. He's shown that he values savage approval more than community safety. The question before us is simple. Do we allow this to continue, or do we take action to protect our families? What kind of action? Jack Morrison asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Henderson's smile was cold as winter wind. The kind that makes it clear where our loyalties lie. The kind that shows the Apache and their sympathizers that Copper Creek won't tolerate betrayal. Thomas felt the room's mood shift, saw hands moving toward gun butts, heard the creak of leather as men prepared for whatever came next. This was the moment that would define not just his future, but the kind of community Copper Creek would become. Before anyone does something they'll regret, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the tense silence. Let me tell you what I learned today. He had their attention now, the room holding its collective breath. That Apache woman, Ayana, she showed me water sources on my land that I never knew existed. She identified plants that can keep cattle alive when grass fails. She knew which of my crops might still be saved and which were lost causes. Thomas paused, letting the words sink in. In 2 hours, she taught me more about surviving in this desert than I'd learned in 7 years of trying. So what? Pete Morrison called out. You want to turn Apache to save your ranch? I want to save all our ranches, Thomas replied, because she wasn't just talking about my land. She knows where every hidden spring within 50 miles is located. She knows which plants can sustain cattle and which will poison them. She knows how to read weather signs that could give us weeks of warning before the next big storm. The room had grown quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence, thoughtful rather than threatening. What are you proposing? Mayor Caldwell asked. I'm proposing that we stop letting pride and prejudice kill our cattle and starve our children. I'm proposing that we learn from people who've been surviving in this land since before any of us were born. Eleanor Henderson's face had gone red with fury. This is exactly what I warned you about. He's been completely turned by these savages. Have I? Thomas asked, his voice calm, but carrying an edge of steel. Or have I simply chosen my children's survival over your hatred? The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Henderson opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the schoolhouse door burst open. A young man Thomas recognized as the telegrapher stumbled inside, his face flushed from hard riding. Mayor Caldwell, I've got urgent news from the territorial capital. The crowd turned toward the newcomer, tension momentarily forgotten in the face of outside news. What is it, son? Caldwell asked. Governor Martinez has announced a new territorial policy regarding Apache relations. All treaties are being renegotiated, and he's specifically calling for cooperative programs between white settlers and peaceful Apache bands. The young man paused to catch his breath. Says the territorial legislature recognizes that Apache knowledge could be crucial for surviving the current drought. The silence that followed was profound. Thomas felt a surge of vindication, but also recognition that politics could change as quickly as weather. Eleanor Henderson's voice, when she finally spoke, was barely controlled. Territorial policy has nothing to do with protecting our own community. Actually, it does, Jack Morrison said, standing slowly, because if the governor's backing cooperation with Apache, anyone who acts against that policy is going to answer to territorial authorities. The threat of outside intervention changed the room's dynamic dramatically. Local disputes were one thing, but defying territorial policy was quite another. Dr. Henley cleared his throat. Perhaps we should consider Thomas's proposal more carefully. If this woman truly has knowledge that could help our community survive the drought, she does, Thomas said firmly, and she's willing to share it in exchange for honest work and fair treatment. Mayor Caldwell looked around the room, reading faces, calculating political wins. I propose we table any direct action, pending further discussion with territorial authorities. In the meantime, perhaps Mr. McKenna could arrange for this Apache woman to demonstrate her claimed knowledge to a small committee of community leaders. It wasn't everything Thomas had hoped for, but it was enough. The immediate threat of violence had passed, replaced by the possibility of reason. Eleanor Henderson gathered her supporters and stalked from the building, her face a mask of frustrated rage, but enough reasonable voices remained to carry the mayor's proposal. As the crowd began to disperse, Father Miguel approached Thomas. I owe you an apology for yesterday's sermon, and perhaps you could arrange for me to meet this woman. I'd like to hear her story myself. Thomas nodded, feeling the tight knot in his chest begin to loosen. I think that can be arranged, Father. 3 weeks later, Thomas stood in his transformed garden, marveling at the green shoots emerging from soil that had seemed hopelessly barren. Ayana worked nearby, teaching Sarah the ancient art of desert cultivation, while Jamie helped tend to cattle that were growing stronger on native grasses they'd learned to recognize. The arrangement wasn't perfect. There were still those in town who viewed it with suspicion, and Thomas knew that one bad incident could reignite the old tensions. But for now, cooperation had replaced hostility, and knowledge had proven stronger than prejudice. As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas reflected on the unexpected harvest his act of mercy had produced. He'd given away his last loaf of bread to save a dying child, and in return had received not just the knowledge to save his ranch, but a reminder of what community could mean when people chose hope over fear. Ayana approached, her son playing with Jamie in the dust of the barnyard. Mr. McKenna, she said, my grandmother used to say that kindness planted in drought seasons grows the deepest roots. Thomas smiled, watching his children laugh with hers, seeing in their innocent friendship the seeds of a future where race mattered less than character, where survival depended not on the color of one's skin, but on the content of one's heart. Your grandmother was a wise woman, he said. Yes, Ayana agreed, her eyes reflecting the last light of day. And wisdom, like water, always finds a way to flow where it's needed most. As darkness settled over the land, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced since Mary's death, a sense of hope for tomorrow and gratitude for the mysterious ways that mercy could transform even the harshest desert into fertile ground for human kindness.